Okay, we should be live, and welcome to everybody. I'm Jill Doherty, and welcome to our discussion here at the virtual Wilson Center. And today, of course, as all of you know, otherwise you wouldn't be here, we're going to be talking about Ukraine. And this week, in fact, today, we have a number of different events coming together at the same time connected with Ukraine. Number one, of course, 6 months since Russia invaded Ukraine for the second time, we should add, and began a full-scale war. It is also the anniversary of Ukraine's independence in 1991. And as I was preparing for this, I read something by Will Pomerantz, who of course is one of our guests and experts, and it does seem to, I think, capture the moment. So I'll just read that very briefly, but I think it's important. Will says, one thing is certain, as long as the war continues, there will be no innocent bystanders. The rest of the world, whether it be in food supplies, energy prices, human migration, or global financial markets, will continue to feel its aftershocks. So this morning, we're going to be discussing a number of those aftershocks with 4 excellent guests, experts who have written about war in a really fantastic new issue of the Wilson Quarterly, The Ripples of War. And I really do urge people to read it. It's beautifully presented, and the material is really top-notch. So let me introduce our guests, and we'll start with Andrian Prokip. He is director of the energy program at the Ukrainian Institute for the Future, which is an independent think tank in Kiev. Also, he is senior associate at the Kennan Institute here at the Wilson Center. And he tracks changes and reforms in the Ukrainian energy sector, as well as developments in the country at large. He's published, he's everywhere, and he's on social media, so we should all follow him. Also, Bruce Gentleson, leading scholar of American foreign policy, has served in a number of positions, policy and political. In 2014, he was a distinguished scholar at the Wilson Center, and his policy positions include senior advisor to the U.S. State Department's policy planning director. He also was senior foreign policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore in the 2000 presidential campaign, and he was at the State Department under Bill Clinton. Then we have Robin Quinnville. She has spent more than 30 years as a U.S. diplomat, serving primarily in Europe, with postings to 2 multilateral organizations, the OSCE and NATO, but she also had bilateral postings to Cyprus, Bosnia, Greece, the United Kingdom, Iraq, and Germany. So extremely experienced. And in Washington, she directed the Office of Western European Affairs at the State Department, and of course, spent a year as the Wilson Center State Department Fellow. Most recently, Robin was the Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin, and she comes back to the Wilson Center following a semester at the Saul Linowitz Visiting Professor of International Affairs at Hamilton College in Clinton, New York. And finally, Will Pomerantz, who is the director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. He really is an expert on the complexities of political and economic developments in Russia, and particularly through the lens of law. He has extensive experience, hands-on and academic, in international and Russian jurisprudence. I have talked to Will even just recently about some issues dealing with Americans who have been held in Russia in prison, and he truly knows the subject inside and out. He also is a specialist in the development of Russia's constitution, human rights law, foreign investment, and sanctions. And I have to plug his book. Will, I hope you don't mind if I plug your book, but it's a Bible. It's called Law and the Russian State, Russia's Legal Evolution from Peter the Great to Vladimir Putin. And as we all know, Vladimir Putin now is talking about Peter the Great more and more. So we have 90 minutes And that seems like a long time, but it never is in Zoom land. And we're looking forward to questions from everyone. So we'll start out. First hour, essentially, will be a discussion among our experts, and then we will take questions from our audience. And let me just read exactly how those questions should be done. So if you want to ask a question during the course of this conversation, you can submit an email, and that address is kennan@wilsoncenter.org. You can also use Twitter, and the handle is @Kennan Institute. And you can also go to our Facebook page at any time. And please include your name and your affiliation. So onward, here we go. I wanted to start with kind of an overview, because this subject of Ukraine, as we all know, is extremely complex. I mean, you have, the human tragedy of this war. Then you have geopolitical, economic, migration, as we were saying. So what I thought I'd do is we can start, each expert can start with summing up the state of the conflict from the perspective of your expertise and maybe your article in the Wilson Quarterly, and then where do you think this is all headed? And Will, could we begin with you? I quoted you, so maybe you can kick us off.
Thank you very much, Jill, both for moderating and for the plug. I think in terms of the conflict and where we are right now, I emphasized in my article in the Wilson Quarterly that this is an imperial war, that it's not just a frozen conflict or an attempt to create a frozen conflict, but it's an attempt to add territory to the Russian Federation. And so what I'm looking at in my article, first of all, is this question of annexation and imperialism, because I think the war in Ukraine and the lead up to it, including the constitutional reforms of 2020, have kind of foreshadowed what Putin's objectives were, that he wanted to supposedly defend Russians abroad, that he would no longer give up any territory of the Russian Federation, and he emphasized the notion of Russia and the Russian language as the language of the state-building people, therefore emphasizing the notion of the state above all else in terms of Russian governance. So that was the first point that I emphasized. And the second point that I just want to deal with is what has been lost after this invasion, because Putin has emphasized national sovereignty, but the consequences of this war have been devastating in terms of Russia's global exposure and global access to international institutions. So Russia no longer is a part of the Council of Europe. It's no longer a part of the European Court of Human Rights. It has been suspended from the Arctic Council and the OSCE. It is no longer a part of the Bologna process, which was an attempt to make Russian degrees basically available and recognized in the European Union, and the list goes on. So I think what is important about this war is that it essentially took, I would argue, 2 weeks to destroy and to eliminate all the things that Russia had achieved in the past 30 years.
Right. And the idea of where we're going, Will, do you have any very quick thoughts to kick us off on that? Where this is headed?
I think we're going to a war of attrition. I don't see either side in the ability to actually win this war at the present time, but none of the countries can afford to lose it as well. So I see this as still a long process, and that both countries are all in, as it were, even though both countries have certain weaknesses and limitations going forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And Robin Quinnville, interested in your perspective too. You have all of these postings in different countries, And you've been, with the OSCE and NATO, it's especially, that's a different perspective. And also, I think we'll put down a marker already about the idea of territorial expansion. I'd love if you can, if you want to at this point, just mention something about that. But please, give us a state of play as you see it.
Right. Thanks very much, Jill. What this war has done to Europe is change its threat perception fundamentally. And it's worth keeping that in mind, that what Russia did by a full-on invasion of Ukraine was to show that it would not respect any of the rules-based norms, any of the agreements, and any of the strictures that were put in place and that European countries view as essential to their peace and security. And while it might have been possible for them to say prior to this invasion that there was a manageable process of dialogue with Russia, that is no longer the case. They see that the threat perception has changed and that they must respond quickly to it. And they have. This is also redefining Europe itself and its institutions, the institutions that were so important to keeping peace. And so you now see the European Union deciding to offer candidate status to Ukraine and to Moldova. You see NATO saying, right, we're going to take on Sweden and Finland, who changed decades of their neutrality in order to join an alliance to deter further action, to strengthen that alliance. So what you see then is Europe has a new threat perception. It's changing to meet it. Individual countries are changing to meet it. And to look ahead, this is now the part where they need to double down on many of the things that they are doing to affect that change, not only to support Ukraine and to continue their support to Ukraine, but also to make the fundamental changes that they need in order to continue that support and to strengthen their own security at home. And I'm going to stop there because I know there's a lot of themes that were coming up.
Absolutely. And, I was just thinking of a follow-up to that, which is, can they maintain that unity and can they maintain sanctions and what we see right now? But maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. But thank you very much, Robin.
Sure.
I'd like to turn to Bruce now. Bruce, your perspective obviously is very broad and historical, and I guess looking at policy, foreign policy, and international relations in a very broad and deep sense. So where do you place this? Where are we? Because everybody that I talk with, and even since the very beginning of the war, I remember a professor saying, this changes everything. Before it was even clear where we were going, this changes everything. But where do you place us right now, and where do you think we're going?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jill, for moderating this, and thanks to my colleagues, and also thanks to the Wilson Center. In addition to my 2014 residence that Jill mentioned, I just finished up another one here earlier in 2022 from January to May, and it's great to be back even in a constrained situation by COVID, and now back being a non-resident global fellow. I've been focusing a lot on the economic sanctions aspects, and this is what I wrote about in the Wilson Quarterly. Actually, I have another piece that was in foreignpolicy.com last week. And I think taking stock of that initially is there's no question the sanctions have had impact. These are the most extensive sanctions pretty much ever imposed, other than ones that were imposed through the United Nations. Even companies, over 1,000 companies have been either getting out or cutting back on their business. And frankly, that's not what companies usually do. And a lot of our China sanctions, American and other companies try to go around them. They've had economic impact, but Putin has managed to contain those costs in a variety of ways, which we can get more into. I think where we are now on that is, it's like what Will said, there's really a sort of a war of economic attrition going on now. Putin is kind of jujitsued with his counter sanctions, particularly cutting the supply of natural gas to Europe. which is affecting industry, which is creating scenarios of possible rationing of home heating as we get into the winter and the like. And the question of whether or not, European solidarity will be worn down by that is an open question. And we as Americans think about how much we've reacted just to higher gasoline prices in our politics. Need to have some perspective on what that would mean if we were actually faced with rationing and the like. There are a variety of things. The thing I'll say, though, is even with the economic impact, there should be no expectation that Putin says uncle. Never happens with sanctions. I've just finished a book, which is coming out next month, on sanctions generally. You can look at Cuba, 60 years of sanctions, huge economic impact, but the regime's still there. North Korea, Iran under Trump in particular, where he ratcheted up the sanctions but didn't have a diplomatic strategy. So ultimately, sanctions are a means to the ends of strengthening your hand for the negotiations, and we can talk more about that. But on your general question, I'm not of the school that this changes everything. It definitely changes Russia and Europe. But if you look around the world, you have countries like India in which we have some shared interests vis-a-vis China in the Indo-Pacific, and that's increased its Russian oil imports from 1% of their oil imports to 20%. You have the Saudis in the UAE that we have lots of issues with that have really resisted increasing production to try to, keep global prices down. The Israelis have resisted sanctions. There's a lot going on in the world that this doesn't change. Climate change, the next pandemic and the like. So I think we need to focus on where it's impacted in ways that it can continue for a long time without falling into the, oh my God, this changes everything, because that's not a good way to think about our overall strategy.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, I can see some debates coming, so this will be good. And Andrian, I wanted to get into it's already kind of raised this a bit, but energy, which is a key element in this war. Can you place us right now? Where are we in this conflict, and where are we going? Andrian, you might be muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Jill. Sure, that invasion of February 24 couldn't bypass European and global energy markets because Russia is the biggest natural gas exporter, and it's in top 3 of biggest crude oil and oil products exporters. And Russia's energy revenues contained for more than half of total Russia's export revenues. And how deep European Union was dependent on Russia's energy, all this brought the West to necessity to impose sanctions against Russia. But that was a trouble again, that Russia was so big energy supplier, especially when we're talking about gas in the European Union, that it was very difficult to substitute Russia's supplies. And this gave for Russia a leverage to blackmail, to make attempts to change attitude to Russia, to change attitude to Ukraine, and to supporting Ukraine from the side of European Union. But I agree completely with that what Robin said, that this invasion has changed Europeans' threat perception, because European Union has saw Russia's military aggressive behavior, and it's so including towards Ukraine. But that is the first time that we saw European unity that they should decrease reliance on Russia's energy supplies. European Commission called Russia's actions as an energy blackmail. Sure, we are not confident about short-term and mid-term future of Russia's supplies to Europe, because now Russia is trying to play the game with European energy markets. They effective prices, and prices can cause dissatisfaction, people's dissatisfaction with governments, and Russia may use other leverages to reshuffle governments in European Union, like it was with Bulgaria. Bulgaria refused to, actually Russia cut gas supplies to Bulgaria because Bulgaria refused to pay with rubles. But now there is a new government in Bulgaria, and they're talking about their desire to negotiate with Russia on gas supplies. So I'm sure that in the long term, Russia will lose their position of energy dominance, especially in Europe, and I'm sure that European course of energy transition will not be changed. However, in the next couple of years, we may see already we do see already more attention to coal usage, more attention to nuclear, and maybe Russia will, with blackmailing, will achieve the goal of selling more energy to Europe than Russia expected. But in long term, sure, we will see a dramatic change in European and global energy markets.
So that blackmailing isn't working, or will not work?
Well, it still isn't working at full extent, but first of all, there are some countries who are allies, Russia's allies in the European Union. First of all, we are talking about Hungary. Hungary was the only state who didn't support this agreement on voluntary decrease of gas consumption in order to save gas in the case if Russia cuts supplies. And we may see attempts of Russia to promote, to facilitate different processes in Europe in order to change governments or governmental positions. But in general, we see that is the first time in recent 20 years how Europe is united towards Russian energy. And the position of Germany is something new that we haven't seen for 20 years. Mm. So I would say that they still are not efficient in blackmailing, but still Russia may go far, and some amendment of policy in some European countries may happen. But again, I believe that in general, Europe's attitude, even this year, for most countries will be the same. And especially that there are some countries in the European Union which have deep concern towards Russia because of historical memory. First of all, it's about Poland, it's about Baltic states, it's about Finland, and these countries are the most tough towards changing European.
Andrian, did we lose? Oh, sorry. It's my screen. You know, I'm seeing kind of a pattern emerging, and maybe we can get into this, but I'd like to pursue kind of where Andrian is going with Robin, that we get back to each side has strengths and each side has weaknesses. And the strengths that, Robin, that you've been talking about in Europe are, you know, the unity, NATO expanding, countries taking steps with sanctions, et cetera. And we raised that issue early on. Can this continue? So could you evaluate the pros and cons of where we are going, especially in light of the fact that we're going into colder weather and the need for heating oil, et cetera?
Yeah, the meme of winter is coming is everywhere, right? And right now, what you see is in many European countries is they know the tactic that Putin is using. They see it. And it is surprising to some who thought, wait, Russia was a dependable partner even in the Cold War. I heard this a lot. Oh, but during the Cold War, even when we had these major differences, Russia was a reliable energy supplier. They have seen now that for Putin, energy is a weapon. And they also see that energy security for Europe is really a whole of Europe discussion, because you've seen the discussions at the EU where they talk about how to reduce dependence on Russian oil and what might be needed for Russian gas as well. So all of that it's very visible that Putin's tactic is to wait them out and try division when demand is most high. And countries are reacting differently to that, and the European Union as well, preparing their people for the possibility of this and businesses. And it's tough because in a country like Germany, it's not just the population that you worry about, but also a very vibrant industrial sector. So I believe it's yesterday and today, the Chancellor of Germany is in Canada talking about LNG. And the Deputy Chancellor has been traveling to places like Qatar and others to try and look for possible LNG sources as well. And the Germans are building those LNG terminals that actually they're putting in floating regasification units that they had looked for bids on 3 years ago. There was, at the time, it wasn't considered to be financially feasible to do this, but now they're looking for ways to bring in LNG as an alternative source. So with that in mind, you see them taking measures to try and bolster their economies, bolster their supply, and they see the tactic, right? And I think as long as they are taking the steps that they are to try and plus up their gas supply in summer to prepare for winter, prepare their people for the possibility of energy saving. Already across Europe, people are turning off the lights on public buildings and so forth to save energy. So it seems to me that because they recognize the tactic and are preparing for it, they are taking the steps necessary. But I think that all of them know that this is not a one season effort either. There's more that needs to be done. I'll stop there.
Yeah, great. Bruce, could I return to this idea of sanctions? Because I think it would be very useful to have an evaluation. You mentioned that they've been effective, but could you get a little more specific? How effective, how have they hurt Russia? And yet you mentioned that Putin has been able to preserve the economy. Maybe it's Ms. Nabiullina who has done that, but in any case, he's been able to kind of keep the economy going. How effective have these sanctions been, and why?
Yeah, sure. In fact, the central bank chair you just mentioned, Jill, had tried to resign back in February, and she was told that really wasn't a good idea. It was not an option, you know. And so she's been doing her best. So they raised interest rates, they put on some capital controls, they raised retiree pensions. All of these are efforts as partial offsets. They found alternative trade partners. I mentioned India before. China, although it's very interesting on China, China has increased its Russian oil imports and provided some other aid, but not nearly as much as that Olympics Eve declaration of partnership with no limits might have led people to believe. So it's kind of interesting to see China being a bit cautious here, supportive in its rhetoric and all that sort of thing, but not showing a partnership with no limits. They've also been sanctions busting. This happens all the time. I mean, North Koreans raised about $2 billion in cryptocurrency by busting their sanctions, and that's North Korea. So there's been what they call dark oil being transferred from one tanker to another at sea. Some companies, Shell, was shown to be mixing in Russian oil with others. So all of that have contained the costs. The costs have been significant in terms of GDP projections. The projections of the GDP now are like they were in the early 1990s chaos that, you know, Russia went through then. And some of the measures they've been using are temporary. It's affected the battlefield because one of the most effective sanctions has been on semiconductors. And there are reports that Russians, I think almost over 2,500 armored vehicles have been lost, largely through the bravery and skill of the Ukrainian resistance and U.S. and NATO aid. They've fired over 70% by one Pentagon count of their precision-guided missiles, and they're taking semiconductors out of refrigerators and dishwashers, which, you know, probably aren't designed exactly the same way. So the economic impact is there. But there was a study that came out the other day that called it driving them into economic oblivion. The Washington Post had an article yesterday that said, we haven't crushed the economy yet. That's really dangerous strategic thinking. Economies don't get crushed to the point where you have to say, uncle. And the crucial thing is converting that economic impact into policy change. And so, like Robin and Andrean said, the markets will change. Europe, you know, got way too dependent on Russian oil and gas, partly to get away from the volatile Middle East. It will rebalance its portfolio. I doubt it's going to go down to zero depending upon where things go in the next 3-5 years in terms of the economics are just too good. And of course, it's dependent upon what happens with the war and with Russia. But the best thing about sanctions is to strengthen your hand for diplomacy. They're not going to take, they're not going to take the place of diplomacy. And that would bring us to, what does the diplomacy look like? Is there a basis for a deal, which we may want to get into? But, there's too much. It's almost like the way we had military power in Iraq. Superior military power was going to carry the day. It didn't. Superior economic power here of the West and its allies was going to carry the day. It didn't. And that's where we are now.
Yeah, good point. We're talking a lot about the kind of nitty gritty sanctions and economics, et cetera. But Will, if I could turn to you, I found your piece interesting because you talked about historical memory and kind of these issues that feel almost squishy, I guess I'd say. They're harder to really kind of grab onto and understand in a quantitative way because you really can't, but qualitatively, that memory of World War II, Robin referred to this also, that during the Cold War, many of the countries or some of the countries in Europe said, well, Russia actually, Soviet Union is a reliable partner, even though we are enemies. So, Will, if you could take us to what has happened about the relevance of World War II in Russian historical memory. I mean, they were brothers in the Soviet Union, Ukraine and Russia. And you mentioned just one more thing. You said the word post-Soviet is not really applicable anymore. That we're way beyond just kind of the post-Soviet period. So could you, I guess my question would be, how is this war changing the post-Soviet world?
Well, those are a lot of issues that you've raised, Joe.
Yeah.
I think what my piece basically argued is that what unifies the Russian Federation, for the most part, is not history or ideology, but this memory of World War II, where Russia was unified. And indeed, Putin has emphasized this memory as being the crucial memory that unites the Russian Federation. And he has extended this memory well beyond its historical limits, most notably by creating this immortal regiment, which he leads every year to discuss and to highlight the importance of this war. But going forward, clearly Ukraine, which has now suffered this horrible war of attrition from Russia, Ukraine, which has been accused by Russia of being Nazis, and of pursuing genocide against Russians. Obviously, Ukraine will not be able or will not see this memory as a memory of unity, but as a memory that Russia has essentially destroyed. And Ukraine will no doubt see that Russia has indeed pursued some of the atrocities that were accused of the Germans in World War II. So essentially, this notion of World War II, which has been the crucial memory of the Russian Federation, will not be able to play the same role going forward that it has played in the past. So that was one of the major points. The other point about the post-Soviet space, obviously there has been a long debate as to how to describe the former members of the Soviet Union. And the most convenient was this notion of post-Soviet. But clearly Ukraine now not only does not consider itself post-Soviet, it has fought for and is in the process of becoming European. So as we look at this notion of memory and how it plays in the region, I think it is important to understand that Ukraine, after this war, will not be a post-Soviet country. It will be a European country, or at least that's what its intention is. And that will also cause ramifications for Russia, who wants to make sure that Ukraine stays part of its sphere of influence.
Mhm. Well, could I follow up on one thing that you said earlier? And that's that issue of territorial aspirations, the empire, et cetera. I guess my question would be, is Russia, with what it is doing in Ukraine, trying to grab new territory in a kind of Peter the Great way, or is it trying to create this cordon sanitaire around the outside of Russia to make sure that NATO can't get closer? Maybe I'm not very artfully saying this, but maybe you get the idea. What exactly are they trying to do? And it didn't turn out perhaps the way Putin wanted, but what was the idea of trying to subvert the government of Zelensky?
I think you've hit on one of the aspects, was that Russia feared that Ukraine was going to join NATO. Now, Biden, when he became president, basically said that Ukraine was not going to join NATO, or we wouldn't back Ukraine's membership of NATO until it dealt with the issue of corruption, which was essentially meaning that it would be a long time before Ukraine would be in a position to join NATO. In the aftermath of the war, it's more likely that now it can, as Robin mentioned, become a part of the European Union. And it now has candidate status to that degree, so that Putin has basically drawn Ukraine more into Europe's orbit when that was not what he wanted to do. Whether he wanted a buffer zone, which was always mentioned in the Soviet Union, I think that that's part of it. But again, it has failed spectacularly, because Sweden and Finland have now joined NATO. So whatever he wanted in terms of his security protection, it has not lived up to his expectations.
Mm-hmm. Andrea, could I turn to you, with your regional knowledge? I just wanted to get into the realistic future that we can expect from Ukraine. And I know this is very difficult, but the country really, many of its major cities lie in ruins. The economy is really hit hard. They've lost, thousands of people. We don't have to really, go too far. The country is really in a bad state, albeit the West is helping very much. But right now they rely on aid, both financial and military from outside. If you look down the road a bit, can Ukraine really survive this and become a functioning country, or continue to be a functioning country in the future?
Well, there is no way out for Ukraine. Ukraine has to survive and to become effective. And sure, today it's very difficult to talk about perspectives and about renovation, because we do not know when the war finishes, how it finishes, what will be the damages. We in Ukraine, we must have an understanding of the vision of Ukrainian economy, because necessity of renovation gives Ukraine a chance to build new, modern, efficient, green economy. And sure, it makes no sense to rebuild the economy, for instance, coal-based economy. But Ukraine should find its role, its place in European economic system. Because the clear thing is that for many Ukrainians, that further collaboration with Russia and Belarus is something that most of people will not accept. So starting from the February 24, Ukraine banned actually all trade with Russia, except of gas transit and oil transit. And people's attitude towards Russia has changed drastically. People's support of the European Union has rising. Sure, Ukraine may be effective, and even now. However, I should say that a role of reforms shouldn't be underestimated, because now Ukraine is exporting electricity to the European Union, which actually was impossible before February 24, when Ukraine has disconnected from Russia. That was a very long process, but this would be impossible if not electricity market reform conducted in 2018. However, there were so many skeptical people about, was Ukraine ready to this or wasn't? So now Ukraine is exporting electricity to the European Union, which is a lot of low carbon electricity. And this electricity helps European Union to partly substitute Russian gas. And this export helps Ukraine to have more export revenues, considering that we have lost a lot of this steel and iron ore exports. But so the task for Ukraine and for society in general is about thinking of the new economic model and the role of Ukraine's economy in the European economic system. And if we manage to do this, if we manage to build transparent, competitive economy, then sure, then Ukraine will be a successful part of the Europe.
Mm-hmm. Robin, could I turn to you, because I think there's a really important issue here. If we kind of shift the focus a little bit to Russia, I mean, Russia was integrating with Europe. There's no question, and it was a member of all of these international groups, multilateral groups. And now, how does Russia continue to, or what kind of a relationship does Russia have with Europe going forward? I mean, you've said there's no trust, at least among many countries in Europe. How does Russia manage this? Are they just the enemy, across the border?
I think it's worth remembering the sea change in thinking about Russia that's taken place. Europeans haven't forgotten that even in 2014 and the events that led up to the revolution and that led up to Crimea were because Ukraine was pursuing a European perspective, a European Union Association Agreement. So it was defining its course in that way. And so over time, you have seen this lack of trust growing. And even in places like Germany that has a substantial population that actually are emigres from Russia over time, and that has traditionally tried to pursue a good relationship with Russia, you now see a position where they are wary of, because they are seeing the weapon that is being used, right? And those who call for dialogue are doing so, I think, in a way that is very cautious, because they see it can be used as a divisive call, and they see the territorial ambitions of Putin. In Germany, they remembered another anniversary this week, and that is that yesterday was the anniversary of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And they see that, they're looking at that and thinking, yes, that was an effort to divide up essentially Eastern Europe. And they see Putin's efforts now as part of that. So I think that as long as they have that wariness, it will be very difficult to have any kind of relationship within these international institutions. And frankly, the latest strategic concept for NATO recognizes that their relationship with Russia has fundamentally changed. And that's
I'm just looking at the clock here, of course. We have about 15 more minutes that we'll be discussing these issues. We could go another hour, but I want to get audience questions. So please feel free in the ways that we discussed, Facebook, Twitter, etc., and email, to send any questions that you have. There really are, I'm sure, a lot of different areas we can pursue. And just as we were talking, I thought I'd throw my 2 cents in, which is I did write an article for the Wilson Quarterly, that edition, and it is on. I went to the Baltics, to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and spoke with Russian journalists who had left Russia, most of them recently, and talked with them about how they continue to do their work while not being in Russia. And it was really fascinating, to me, a fascinating experience to talk with them. And a couple of takeaways. Obviously, we're talking about brain drain. And this is brain drain of some of the best and the brightest in Russia. Definitely, most of them are opposed to Putin, but they are very intelligent and communicative people. They are the people who are, talking with their counterparts in Russia. So the question came up, which I asked all of them: how do you remain part of the conversation, so to speak, if you are not physically in Russia? They maintain that you can. They maintain that because there is the internet, there are all sorts of websites starting up, but especially YouTube. Almost everybody I talked to had a YouTube channel. In fact, I was interviewed on one of them, which is 2 people who used to work for Echo Moscow Radio, which I'm sure a lot of our people in the audience here know about. And so they have a YouTube channel, and there are many other people who do too. And those are accessible in Russia, although Russia would have to check the latest, but they were trying to shut down access to YouTube, as the government has shut down access to many social network opportunities for people to spread their message. And I think the other takeaway might be useful to talk about this a little bit, is that you could look at this brain drain as a loss for Russia, but actually you could look at it as perhaps Vladimir Putin does, which is getting rid of the troublemakers. These people who are opposed to the war and who are opposed to Putin, in Putin's eyes, are the troublemakers. He has referred to them as scum and not patriots, obviously scum and kind of vermin, which should be kicked out of Russia anyway. So it will be to me, it would be really important to see, do some of them go back to Russia? If so, when? Almost all of them want to go back to Russia. But what happens to Russia without people like this? And I can tell you just, my impression, because I do watch the media a lot and follow this, the propaganda level right now is about as high as I have ever seen it. It's virulent. It is very focused on attacks on Ukraine and Ukrainians, which is really kind of shocking. So anyway, I just throw that in there because there is that element, which I think is not specifically the subject that we're talking about this morning, but the future of Russia is tied to a certain extent, a very, I think, big extent, to what is happening in Ukraine. So let's see, with about 10 minutes to go, maybe we can kind of go quickly through some issues. But Will, I'd like to go back to you. And your area is the law and legal issues. What Putin did by invading, which is really the second invasion of Ukraine, as we know, and then starting a war against another country, in the West is perceived as a terrible violation, a gross violation of international law. How does Putin square this with his idea that he is the person who, respects the law, and internationally Russia always abides by law, et cetera? How does he marry those two ideas? They seem totally contradictory.
Well, they are contradictory, and Putin will have to deal, and Russia will have to deal with international law going forward. And there are attempts in Ukraine to investigate the atrocities that have been dealt to Ukraine. There are statutes in Ukraine, such as crimes against aggression, that potentially could involve Russians, although it's difficult to imagine when Vladimir Putin can come under the jurisdiction of Ukraine. And there are other kind of attempts to prosecute and deal with the events in Ukraine. It's interesting. You talked about this being the anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Putin basically passed a law a few months ago saying that it is illegal to equal or have equivalence between the Soviet leadership in World War II and Germany. And there are administrative fines that now attach to such statements. So Russia is still trying to deal with its history and what it's trying to cover up in its history. And it's also trying to deal with now whether it will somehow come under the principles that were laid out in Nuremberg and the Nuremberg principles, and whether they will now impact the Russian Federation. So it's an ongoing issue, but a lot of lawyers are looking into what are the potential crimes of the Russian Federation, and they're also trying to deal with how Russia may come under international jurisdiction and the crimes that were expounded at Nuremberg.
Thank you, Will. I'm looking at both the time and the chat, and we actually have quite a few questions. Some of them are very interesting, and I think maybe we move to some of them. So let me just pick some of the ones that have come in. There is one from, I'm sure you know, Ambassador William Courtney. He asks, and it's a very topical issue, what might be the risk that the Dugina assassination could spark more aggressive military action? And we all know that this 29-year-old daughter, her name is, I believe, Daria, is the daughter of an ideologue from the ultra far right. And she was blown up. I'll just keep it very brief, but I'm sure you all know this. Over the weekend, she was riding in a car that apparently her father would have been riding in, and the car had a bomb, it exploded, she died, and this has become a very big deal in Russia. She is being presented as a martyr. And remember that Dugin, the father, is a proponent of kind of this Russia leading the Slavic world. He is very pro-war. And so the question is, were they trying to kill the father, the daughter? This is beyond what we want to talk about right now, but it's an important moment. So could we decide who would like to take the Dugin question? Anyone want to jump in, or should I pick someone?
I'll speculate. I think it really is an interesting one, like you said, Jill, in a couple of respects. I mean, one version is that the Russians have been trying to propagate is Ukrainians did this, and the Ukrainians have, said, A, we didn't do it, and B, why would we do this? This would be counterproductive for us. A second one that you hear out there is that it was almost like a false flag, somebody trying to push for Putin to escalate further, whether in Ukraine, challenging President Biden's not 1 inch of NATO territory, playing again with the nuclear threat. And the third is some third party. I mean, this is what happens to these, that's neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians, but feels like they want to throw, gasoline on the fire for whatever their reasons are. And so what it shows for me is that we talk about a grinding war, and it's hard to imagine a settlement. But the grinding war is no way has an equilibrium. There can be inadvertent escalations, intentional, and this is an example of the kind of thing that can happen as we move into fall and winter. That I think is really of concern in terms of this getting worse than it already is, and it already is pretty bad.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Could I jump in, Jill, on that and say, and just add that it's not like Russia has not conducted attacks on European territory before. And I'm thinking of the case of Sergei Skripal. I'm also thinking of the murder of an activist in the Tiergarten, where Russia was held to be responsible for that. And so if you think about what ways in which things might escalate, it's worth remembering that there have been these actions before.
Good point. There's a good question here coming from another ambassador. Lots of ambassadors watching this, obviously, they're interested. And this is Ambassador George Kroll, who was the ambassador to Belarus, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. And he is saying there's a third country deeply involved in the Ukrainian crisis for the last 6 months, Belarus, which 2 years ago was undergoing its own crisis. Could the speakers comment on how the last 6 months have affected Belarus and its future, and perhaps other former Soviet republics such as Kazakhstan? Great question. Who would like to take that? Andrian, are you up for that, or?
Well, I can try at least, and but probably some panelists will be happy to answer as well. So regarding Kazakhstan and Belarus, these two cases are absolutely different. So as of now, we see, so initially Russian troops were attacking Ukraine not only from Russia, but also from Belarus. And now what we see that Russian air forces are shooting Ukraine from Belarusian side. Ukraine has, well, actually has broken relations with Belarus without much formalities. And looks like that Putin would like Lukashenko to join the war, but Lukashenko is doing everything he can in order not to kill his army, because starting the war in Ukraine for Lukashenko may seem mass rallies and maybe losing the power. So that is the risk. So Lukashenko is frightened. He doesn't feel like starting the war, and he tries to look for excuses for Putin. And Lukashenko's rhetorics towards Ukraine has changed a lot, because 2 weeks before the war, 2 months before the war, Lukashenko was talking like in Solovyev style, that there is like no army in Ukraine and they can invade and conquer Ukraine in 3 days. But in 2 weeks, Lukashenko's speeches were absolutely different. And Kazakhstan case is very interesting, because Kazakh president didn't want to recognize so-called Donetsk and Luhansk republics, and there was some other, and Kazakhs support Ukrainians a lot. And what we see that there are some tensions between Russia and Kazakhstan, particularly it's about Kazakh oil exports, because so Russia is trying to suspend Kazakh's oil export. But so I think the fact that all Russian plans to conquer Ukraine in 3 days or 3 weeks has failed. These states, former Soviet Union states, who may at least try to play the game of their independence from Putin, they realize that joining the war and making the union with Putin may just be a serious problem for those states. So they are trying to play their own game, understanding that Russia has weakened.
Okay, there's a question here which I think is important.
Sorry, Jill. It looks like that Will.
Yes, I just wanted to add one small comment, is that Putin has emphasized the Eurasian Economic Union as a buffer against these sanctions. But as Andrian mentioned, there is now real disagreement amongst the countries of the Eurasian Economic Union as to the trade flows and its ability to maintain this the privileges that come with joining the Eurasian Economic Union, so that all these issues are also playing a role in Putin, because he's trying to say, oh, we have a trading bloc that is pretty stable, but it's not.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. There's a question here, a serious one. We talked about, the human suffering, and this question is from Madeline Shaw, who's at Dartmouth College. She says, from Bucha to Kharkiv to Mariupol, sexual violence in Ukraine has been well documented since early March. In your opinion, why is sexual violence such a prominent feature of Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Could Russia's use of sexual violence be a marker of genocide or ethnic cleansing? And if so, how would that be proved? Robin, you have I think probably a good perspective on this question.
I'll take a start at this. And I know that Will, with his background in international law, will also be helpful on this. I think that right now, of course, you are seeing these come via all kinds of various testimonies and so forth. And this is the point at which all of that needs to be collected and documented for the future. And I think that that is happening. And in many ways, I think it's important to recognize how difficult that is for those who are experiencing it to do at the same time that they are also fighting for their lives. But without that process happening, it will be very difficult to hold perpetrators to account. It is sadly a tactic that we've seen before in war. And what I think that we need to see here is that the international community needs to also have a focus on supporting efforts to bring that evidence to the fore for the eventual effort to prosecute. Will, I'm going to ask you with your legal background to add into that.
No, I think you described it pretty well, Robin. Yes, the question is, how can these incidents and atrocities be brought to justice? And there are some means, but they're very difficult. And they have loads of different types of jurisdiction issues. So, for example, in order to charge Russia with a charge of with the crime of aggression, it would have to have signed the Rome Statute when the ICC, the International Criminal Court, was established. Russia has not signed the Rome Statute, and therefore it is a huge loophole as to whether Russia can be brought to justice to the ICC. And that's just one example. The other thing I think I would just like to mention is, I think the crimes of the Russian army just shows how disorganized it is, and how the failure of leadership, and that they are committing these crimes, and not only against women, but they're stealing refrigerators, sending back other equipment to Russia. It's really not a disciplined army, and that is just one of the reasons why Russia has has shown so many weaknesses in this war.
I'll just put a little footnote in here, which might be useful. This really is the most documented war in history. Everybody has a phone, everybody is taking pictures. And I can tell you that at CNN, for example, which I worked for a long time, and I continue to do some commentary for them, they have a team, and I'm presuming some other people have something similar, which is a team that analyzes the video that's coming in. It could be from phones, it could be from cameras, and often becomes part of the story documenting these violations. But it's not always clear, is it real? Was it done when they say it was taken? And so there are teams that actually analyze that, and they look at what's called the metadata that is usually encrypted into those pictures. and they can analyze, was that atrocity actually shot a week ago in Bucha, or is it something from a year ago? And it's a very interesting thing in the propaganda war to see some of these things being debunked. In other words, on the internet, there's a lot of fake news out there of something that might be a picture. Actually, I've seen pictures from Syria, purportedly coming from Ukraine. But I think ultimately, if there's any way to prove what has happened, there should be probably more documentation of this than almost any, war in history. So I'm going to move on to another question. And I think this actually would be a great one. Well, it could be, Bruce, I want to maybe get to you. It's kind of an Andrian question and a Bruce question, which is pretty simple. Kay Halpern asks, how is war-torn Ukraine able to export electricity to Europe? Andrian, do you want to start?
Yeah. So how can Ukraine export electricity to Europe?
With all the destruction of the war, the question.
Well, yeah. The destruction affected some specific regions, which means sure, Ukraine has lost as of now about 10 gigawatt of installed capacities of power generation, but because of the war, consumption has decreased for 30-35%. And this actually, comparing losses of power generation capacities and losses, a decrease in consumption, that gives Ukraine a surplus of capacity, which makes us capable to export the electricity to the European Union. Sure, if the consumption was the same as the last year, considering that we have lost more than 10 gigawatt of already installed capacities and Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is under risk, we wouldn't be able to export this electricity to the EU.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to? Bruce, did you want to chime in on that, or?
I think Andrian hit it on the head. I'll hold back for whatever you have coming.
All right. This is a big question and kind of a complex one. It's coming from Russell Zanka from Northeastern Illinois University. What are the most likely scenarios for an exit strategy for Russia that does not end with a major seizure of Ukrainian territory, given the power of Russian leadership that has a clear imperial fascist inclination? Kind of a complex question. Bruce?
I'll get the ball rolling on that. I'll actually start with a point that Andrian made a little earlier. I think the many ways in which this is producing the opposite effects that Putin and his people might have thought is, many of the pro-Russian mayors and other local officials in the Donbass, you hear about them saying not anymore, right? And so, the notion that whether culture, family, language, so they actually have, reduced their pull or attractiveness in Ukraine. And it does get us to, again, as I said at the outset, sanctions, nothing else is going to make Putin say uncle. And to me, there are a couple scenarios that can happen here. One is, talking before, the war grinds on, subject to all sorts of risks that it escalates intentionally or unintentionally. That may be the one that seems the most likely at this point. The other is that it escalates, whether it's to another country, Moldova, or a NATO country, or it starts to go up that nuclear ladder. And the third is some sort of agreement. And it won't be saying uncle. It won't be the Russians absent. It just won't happen. And so there you wonder whether internally, the questioner's asking about this, you do hear reports of some discontent out there. We're not looking at a Gorbachev rising or protests in the streets bringing down a government. But even, deeply nationalistic Russians, including from the Siloviki, from the military and intelligence establishment, we're seeing what this is doing to their military. right? They're asking for volunteers from North Korea. I mean, how can a proud Russian really want to do that? And whether or not there's pressure to try to come to some sort of agreement is the only other scenario to me, other than grinding on so-called frozen conflict, and this one won't freeze like in other parts of the world, or escalation. And there, the United States and the West and the Ukrainians, have to really be thinking about, how do we use the strong hand we'd bring to those negotiations, and what would we think is an acceptable settlement, both on the grounds, policy-wise, and politically in Europe, in Ukraine, and at home. And that, I think, is really important to start your thinking about, even though I'm not saying you're going to need to do that in the next couple of weeks or so.
Mhm. Yes, sadly. Anybody else want to join that question, or we'll move on to another? There are plenty. There's one from, let's see, Amarellas Lugo de Fabriz from Howard University. I was wondering if you could comment on the effects of the war on college-age Ukrainians and Russians. I know a bit about that. Is there anybody in our experts who would like to answer some of that? Yes, Andrian?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part of the question.
I'll repeat it. Can you comment on the effects of the war on college-age Ukrainians and Russians? So we're looking at the different demographic. Bruce, did you have your hand up?
I was really pointing at Andrea and his hand. But let me just say that one aspect of that I know a little bit about is there's been an effort, and I think the Wilson Center may be involved in this too, Duke University, where I am, and others, to bring scholars, and also a whole association of libraries around the United States have been working with the Ukrainians to, digitally archive, to help them get their records out. And that's not exactly what the person was asking, but I think that's an important part that has its own value.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, maybe I'll just quickly jump in. As Bruce was just mentioning, I think the most direct effect is on, young Russians and Ukrainians who are fighting. They're among, certainly not the, all of the people, but a lot of the people who are dying are young people. And if you look at some of the statistics about how many Russians have died, and also Ukrainian soldiers, it's highly significant. I mean, I've seen figures, and correct me if I'm wrong, but 75, 80,000 killed and injured among the Russians. Nobody really knows, because Russia doesn't always, give those statistics, but it's really going to affect Russia. And it's going to affect Russia on an individual basis, a body coming home to be buried, and the news among the community spreading. Certainly the Kremlin does not want to talk about that. And but I think that it is penetrating the society. That said, when you look at some of the statistics, and again, this is very, very hard to pin down, because any public opinion polling, you can't really trust it in the circumstances of, Russia right now in the midst of war. It's very, very difficult for anyone to express perhaps their true feelings. But you do have, just as a whole, not surprisingly, older people supporting the war more than young people. And older people, of course, to me, it makes sense. Remembering World War II, remembering how families lost people in World War II. And the word Nazi is not a theoretical concept. I mean, Russia dealt with Nazis during World War II. So older Russians tend to believe the idea, which is incorrect, of course, that Ukraine is a Nazi-controlled country. The younger people, because they're on the internet, they are not watching TV. Very few young Russians are watching TV. They're on the internet, but so that means that they can be exposed to a lot more information. But of course, the Russian, Kremlin-controlled media also are on the web and spreading their own version of what's happening. But I think the saddest thing to me is that Russian students will really not have a chance to go to the West to study, that they will be, ostracized. And we have the push in Europe to even keep tourists, Russian tourists out. So they are becoming, to me, very sadly, a pariah nation and its people, which will have long-lasting effects, generation effects on Russians, not to mention what's happening to the Ukrainians from a different perspective. Anybody else want to say anything about that? Yes, please.
Yeah, just two remarks, because so you said that Russia was dealing with Nazis during the Second World War. Actually, Ukrainians did the same because that was the part of single country, and millions of Ukrainians died in this war. And another comment about youth. So the interesting fact that mostly Russian soldiers come from poor regions.
Mhm.
Because so number of soldiers dying in Russian soldiers dying in Ukraine from Moscow, St. Petersburg is very small, and for these people from these poor Russian regions, going to war is the way to make money, the same as for their families. And when talking about impact on Ukrainian youth, so I should also say that I should mention that in recent month or two, among the targets that Russian choose for attacks with cruise missiles are universities and colleges. So in a few cities, they have destroyed universities. I have no idea why do they do this, but they still do.
Mhm. Okay.
If I could add one little bit, I was teaching up at Hamilton, and one of the professors there arranged a video link with students in Lviv, and between our class and them, and I think we should not forget some of the day-to-day impacts this is having on students attempting to pursue their studies, that they are also volunteering in ways to try and help their community have resilience. They are sometimes volunteering to go elsewhere in Ukraine in order to try and provide support for people who are fighting, or for families, and that their families are also often scattered in Europe, even if they themselves have stayed in Ukraine. And so when you're looking at the impact that it has had on a generation of students, that is something where I think we in the West need to make sure that we are also paying attention to ways that we can support their future.
Yeah, definitely. There's an interesting question here about a country that we haven't mentioned so far, Turkey. And this is from Natasha Ryakovich. She says, how do we take into account and factor in the new role of Turkey as key negotiator in the war, looking forward strategically about our security architecture? What does it mean for the EU?
So I think that I should start on this one, and I'll ask others to, like Bruce, to jump in. What has been interesting is that sort of by virtue of its geography, our NATO ally Turkey has actually been effective in trying to arrange for example, food supplies to exit the port of Odessa in order to prevent the kind of food crisis that just a few months ago we were all anticipating would be the case. And there have been some shipments, and that has been a hopeful sign. And I think that we should all simply say, right, this is a very good sign that they have been able to do that, because it impacts the world. And the United Nations has been involved in this. This is something where we see that this unintended consequence, that they're trying to address this. And because Turkey is a NATO ally, this affects also how we look at the role in the security architecture of Europe. And for the EU, where Turkey has long been a candidate country, they will be able to continue that process with them and that discussion with them. But I think it is a good sign to see Turkey engage in trying to be helpful in resolving this particular issue, which has implications that are well beyond the region. And I'll just stop there.
Mhm.
Yeah, I just to add, I think Robin made a lot of really good points here. I think Erdogan seems to be going through a reassessment of his foreign policy strategy. He has been trying to renew relations with Israel, which is he'd really Turkey way back was a friend of Israel, and then he moved significantly away from that. And so he seems to be trying to find a role. He does have a relation to the Russians. We had a dispute with Turkey over the air defense systems they were buying from the Russians that NATO was quite concerned about. So, it fits the notion that it's almost like if you had a Venn diagram, and you see where Turkey's interests overlap with the US, overlap with the EU in that common shaded area. And then they have different interests, and that's not going to change. I think the potentially positive part is they seem to be, in that overlapping Venn diagram area, they seem to be pursuing more there than they were before, both vis-a-vis the Middle East. And, frankly, if somebody credible and reliable can be the party that breaks the ice and starts the negotiation, it doesn't have to be us, as long as it's consistent with what our interests and objectives are.
Anybody else? Okay. There's a question here about the far north. Let me just pull it up here. Okay, this is from Anita Parlow, who's asking on ripples, ripples from the effects of this war. Even given Finland and Sweden accession to NATO, the combination of increased military exercises, Svalbard, which I guess I don't really know that much about it, but is it a base? Not quite sure. And other related Arctic issues, what ripples might we expect in the high north? Anybody want to take that? It's a little different, but it's a fascinating question.
Well, I just think that Russia has strong economic interests in the far north, and that these interests will continue to develop. And the fact that there is now less communication in the Arctic Council and less ability to bring Russia into that dialogue will, I think, allow Russia to pursue its economic interests even more so, and not take into account the issues of the environment.
There's a question here, which is kind of a disturbing one when you think about it, but we kind of tangentially got into it by mentioning the nuclear power plant. But this is from David Sobelson, who says, how will the West respond when, in frustration about the military's lack of progress, Putin launches chemical weapons on the people of Ukraine? How will the West's reaction to Bashar al-Assad's use of chemical weapons against his own people in Syria affect Putin's calculation? Does the West have any non-military options left to use against Russia? So this concern about weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, etc. Who would be a good person? Maybe Bruce, would you like to?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It fits in that basket I was talking about before about escalations. Putin is, in some ways is likely to escalate if he feels that the house is coming down on top of him. Why not bring it down on everybody else as a military strategy that says escalation is going to achieve your objective? And again, the Assad issue and the Obama red line that wasn't kept as a red line, that could affect, the West and the United States in either way. One could be now more than ever, it's important to respond because we didn't last time. Or it could be the same dilemmas of responding. So it's very hard to say what would be done. You can imagine it's another rationale for bringing more people into the sanctions, for upping the international condemnation. Whether or not that, makes a difference, you don't know. But I doubt that it would be tit for tat with we start to respond with our own versions of WMD. I think that would be really very, very dangerous. But anyway, that's a sense of what the considerations might be on both ends.
Yeah. Bruce, let me follow up with something else. I guess since the beginning, there has been the feeling that the Biden administration is kind of, I almost said temporizing, but they're being very moderate in their response. It's less so right now, but in the beginning, because of the fear that maybe Putin would use nuclear weapons, perhaps not, ballistic ICBMs coming over the ocean, but perhaps tactical weapons, demonstration in Ukraine. What do you think is really, truly the probability of something like that? Do you think that Putin would do that?
I think it's not zero, Jill, and it's not 60 or 70%, but given the nature of WMD, any probability above, really, really small one, you have to take into account. And here I have to say, if you're National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Secretary of State Blinken, others who, friends and colleagues I've worked with in other capacities, it is your responsibility to take account of that. Many other people are free to say, oh, you're being too cautious in Congress or elsewhere. And if, frankly, it were to escalate and you were to use weapons, you might be blamed by the same people. So it is a very real factor to have to take account. And it's a little bit like the debate back in April over no-fly zone. There were people pushing for that part because of the humanitarian aspects. To be honest, I was one of those people who signed a letter saying I thought it was a bad idea. Today the president announced another $3 billion in aid for Ukraine. So I wouldn't say they're temporizing. I think they're doing increasingly more over time, the sophistication of the weapons. But, as President of the United States and your senior advisors, you have to take risk calculations into account and balance those with ways in which they get in the way of your objective, more than anybody else does who's cutting into this from Congress or elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Okay, unfortunately, I am looking at the clock and we have literally 5 minutes left, which happened awfully suddenly. Could we have this is a lightning round of any last thoughts? And I think we'll go on my screen. It's Robin, Andrian, Bruce, and Will, but really quiet because we only have 5 minutes. So please, Robin, if you could start, just any last thoughts.
Sure. I think that it's worth remembering that for Europe, this is the time when they're going to really have to be in it for the long haul. We're going to start seeing them decide how much they can continue that implementation, change their own energy structures and so forth, continue to provide for Ukraine. And this is going to be the toughest part, right? Because you're going into this tough winter and it is going to be the time when they need to deliver. And in some countries like Italy, you're seeing also elections that are playing into this. So I'd say, yeah, this is the in it for the long haul phase.
Mm-hmm. Andrian?
Thanks. I agree that this winter is possessing huge risks both for Europe and much more risks for Ukraine. And some officials from intelligence, both from Ukrainian and foreign, say that Ukraine, even American former officials and experts say that Ukraine has the chance to finish the war by the next year if Ukraine has more weapons, modern weapons. And we shouldn't forget that the favorite Putin's game is it's blackmailing. It's like blackjack. So when he's raising bets and just waiting that others will get frightened and step back. He has some pain regarding Caribbean crisis, and he's sure that Soviet Union lost the battle of Caribbean crisis, and now he tries to do something very similar. And I believe that the situation where the nuclear terrorism at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is something that he may try to use in this game. But that is thing that we, the whole world, should prevent, because this is going to be a disaster for the whole Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. Bruce?
Yeah, I think continue to ensure that Putin doesn't succeed, but also at the same time, really be thinking, working on what a deal would look like that is both policy sound and politically acceptable to us, the Europeans and the Ukrainians. He's not going to say, uncle. It's not going to be unconditional surrender. And how can we get to that situation where you have a genuine opportunity to end the war on terms that, maintain Ukraine and are favorable to the United States and the West?
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Will, last but not least, Will Pomerantz.
So I think that what this war also demonstrates is that Russia still doesn't understand its own human capital and doesn't take advantage of its human capital. And Bruce has talked about sanctions, but the brain drain will be a significant loss for Russia going forward. So I'm looking at, what does Russia, how does Russia recover from the sanctions and the brain drain and its isolation to the rest of the world?
Well, this was really a great panel, and I thank everybody on the expert panel, Andrian Prokip, Robin Quinnville, Bruce Gentleson, and Will Pomerantz. And thank you very much. Please check out that Wilson Quarterly because it has some really wonderful articles. And thank you. I think we're about to end.
Thank you, Jill.